Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. So, we finally come to the end of our epic series chronicling what we call the second golden age of rock, spanning the years 1964 through 72. Why do we end this all in 1972? Well, this is the year that marked the end of the 1960s hangover and when the 1970s really kick-started into high gear. The years 1970 and 71, for as wonderful as they were for music, still felt like the aftermath of the musical revolution of the 1960s. Starting in 72, you get to hear, see, and feel a distinctly new musical decade take shape. This year, the 1970s really began with styles and sounds that would dominate the next several years before punk and disco pushed back. While T-Rex kickstarted glam rock a year earlier, it's David Bowie with his epochal Ziggy Stardust album that really made it a household word and gave it its bona fide superstar, as well as kicking off the career of one of the most influential rock artists who ever lived. The blaxploitation movement in American cinema hit full swing the year before with the movie Shaft and its superb Isaac Hayes soundtrack. But it was in 1972 with a lesser film called Superfly that Curtis Mayfield provided a soundtrack that not only raised the bar for movie music in blaxploitation films and beyond, but he also created an opus of deep, thoughtful, funky soul and socio-political commentary that was every bit as powerful, if not more so, than what Marvin Gaye achieved the year before. Speaking of Gaye, while his What's Going On was a clarion call for R&B soul artists to delve into more serious artistry and esoteric expression, it was Stevie Wonder who walked right in that open door and started dominating R&B and soul for the rest of the decade with a stirring run of brilliant albums, beginning with 1972's Talking Book. Al Green became a crossover pop star with a pair of scintillating albums this year and began to cement his status as arguably the greatest R&B singer of the 1970s. While country rock was born in the late 1960s, it was in 1972 that the Eagles released their self-titled debut album and became the first crossover superstar band of that subgenre, going on to dominate the rest of the decade. Other debut albums that set the musical and stylistic stage for the rest of the decade include the debut albums by glam art rock band Roxy Music, the jazz-tinged, sophisticated R&B soul rock hybrid of Steely Dan, the motorique rhythms and experimental soundscapes of the German band Neu, helping influence legions of electronic music artists throughout the 1970s and legions of indie and alternative rock bands in the distant future. And Big Star, a band who didn't sell any records in their time, but whose brand of emotional, irresistible power pop would go on to influence and inspire a seemingly endless number of indie and alternative bands in the 1980s and 90s. And, of course, no story of the year 1972 is complete without the Rolling Stones. Escaping tax evasion in the south of France and amidst a fog of drugs, booze, and groupies, they managed to create a double album masterpiece that not only was the absolute peak, but not quite the end, of their golden run of albums, but also quite possibly the greatest rock and roll record ever made. It's the end and the beginning of an era. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Okay, so before we go back in time to 1972, we need to go into a different realm, a special realm, a beautiful realm that we call the parallel universe. Isn't that right, Arturo?
Yes, this is the place where if rock were still a viable mainstream pop cultural zeitgeist genre, if that were the case, these bands and these artists would be huge. They'd be on the cover of magazines or on the main pages of websites, whatever, and they would be trending very highly on social media instead of being the niche artists that they mostly are in our universe.
Yeah, absolutely. And they would be filling arenas, and tickets would still cost $25 each.
And not 100
or $10 each. Yeah, like the Black Keys getting charged, charging $100 for tickets. Yeah, that's kind of ludicrous,
Pearl Jam is charging $100 for tickets. That tells you how bad things are getting when Pearl Jam are charging that much.
Yeah, I know. What are you gonna do? Yep, absolutely. So on that note, that's a long way of saying that this parallel universe segment is where we cover new and newish records by artists that we think that you would dig and that you should be putting up on a pedestal, much in the way a parallel universe would. So in that case, Arturo, you're covering one of your favorites of parallel universe vintage.
Yes.
This week or on this episode,
this
correct?
Is Kelley Stoltz and his new album La Fleur, which is French for the flower. Now, Kelley Stoltz isn't just an underground niche artist. He's the underground niche artist's underground niche artist. Needless to say, he doesn't sell many records, or in modern day parlance, he doesn't have a high number of streams. Indeed, he makes his real money as a sideman and touring member of Echo and the Bunnymen. Nevertheless, hailing from the San Francisco area, Stoltz has been releasing albums since the mid-noughties, or the aughts, however you want to call it. And for the past 11 years, it's remarkable how consistent the quality of his output has been. His earlier work was a texture-rich amalgam of Brian Wilson, Fleetwood Mac, REM, and Wilco. In later years, his music has come to resemble a post-psychedelic haze that evokes artists as disparate as David Bowie, Kraftwerk, Neu, The Cars, The Smiths, and even The Strokes. That covers quite a bit of ground. And you can hear a bit of all of those influences on this latest album. The motorique rhythms of 1970s krautrock merge with the melodicism and earworm textures of 1980s new wave pop on the album opener Human Events. The lead single, Hide in a Song, takes the jangly guitar pop of early REM and gives it the thrust of peak period Strokes. The other single, Rennie's Car, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a hilarious biographical account of Stoltz house-sitting for Rennie, the drummer of the Stone Roses, in an appropriately Stone Roses-esque slice of lush indie pop. Other standout tracks include the glorious melancholy and romanticism of About Time, a song so Smiths-esque that you can imagine it was written for Morrissey, and the post-goth alt-rock of Eye to Eye, I as in EYE to letter I, which sounds like something his paid gig, Echo and the Bunnymen, would have put out back in the day. Yes, you can play a game of spot the influence with Kelley Stoltz's music, but it's a thrilling, compelling, and often rewarding game. Stoltz belongs on a list of bands and artists that I call the Dependables. That is, you know what you're going to get, and it's going to be good. A solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. Chris?
Yeah, pretty good record. And yeah, it's probably the most British sounding record from an American any of us will hear in 2024.
Really is.
Yeah, I mean, it just has that Echo and the Bunnymen psychedelic furs thing going on, especially on songs like Hide in a Song has some of that going on. But Losing My Wild, especially, is very Echo and the Bunnymen. And so, Stoltz knows how to mine that British territory, the 80s British territory, as well as anybody. And so,
right.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not as big a fan as you are of his. I find some of his stuff kind of boring, but at its best, like I said, he's tuneful, he's melodic, and he's clever, and so that's all you can really ask for in a modern indie rocker. So yeah, I can dig Stoltz's good stuff, and and kind of slough off his bad stuff. And again, so long as he's cranking out stuff like Losing My Wild,
Yeah.
he has a good place in the parallel universe. So I can see why you like him. He's up your alley, much more than he is up mine.
And this
Uh,
this next band is a permanent member of the parallel universe. Shows up
yeah.
5 times a year.
Yeah, well, seems like it. It showed up it shows up at least several times a year. I mean, at least twice a year. But amazingly, it's the first time that we're covering them in the parallel universe in 2024. We're of course talking about King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. I am our resident King Gizzardologist, and this is the eighth time that I am covering a King Gizzard record in 3.5 years. The sad part is that they've released 11 records since then. So I haven't even covered all the records. And it's still eight that number eight. So
Right.
it's pretty prolific band here. So let's talk about their newest record, Flight B741. Modern rock and roll's grandest and most prolific chameleons are finally back. I say finally back because Australia's King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard normally are an unrelenting sort of band, cranking out albums at a furious pace and changing genre and the experiment du jour at an even more furious pace. But Flight B741 is their first album of 2024, coming out all the way here in August. This follows the release of 2 records in 2023 and a whopping 5 albums in 2022. It may not sound much to say that Flight B741 is the band's best album since 2022's Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava until you realize that was 5 albums ago already. That's how it goes in this internet age marked by its lack of gatekeepers. But as I said, Flight B741 is their best record since 2022's glorious and accurately titled Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava. What's that album about? There you go. This effort certainly surpasses both of last year's efforts. The dopey but mad fun speed metal ode to Godzilla called Petrodragonic Apocalypse, and the so terrible it needs to be heard to be believed electronic rock album The Silver Cord, a golden turd of the highest order. What makes this album so good? Really, it's the same thing that put Ice Death et al. Near the top of this band's discography, which is an undying love for the jammy edge of the early 1970s classic rock canon. But unlike on Ice Death et al., they don't dabble in Santana, reggae, and Frank Zappa. They're not going for anything that unhinged and unfiltered this time. Rather, they get strangely but marvelously reverent for the loosey-goosey but song-heavy stylings of Traffic, Joe Cocker, Stephen Stills, and other artists who mixed in a little jazz, country, and folk into their otherwise space-worthy jams. And they do it on a concept record about a hippy-dippy plane ride out of a lousy, stifling hometown, or something like that. Here, King Gizzard brings out the harmonica several times and or get their stomp on, as they do on album opener Mirage City, on the hillbilly goof of the Hog Calling Contest, and the White Boy Funky title track. They make things rockier and more guitar heavy on songs like Raw Feel and Le Risque, and they even border on bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd and Nazareth, of all bands, Nazareth, on the album's best song, the banging, swinging, riff-tastic Field of Vision. So, yep, a band that was doing an A- impression of Metallica 1+ year ago is now pulling off an A- impression of Steve Winwood and Steve Stills here in the latter half of 2024. I'm not always blown away or even moved by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard's music, but I'm always incredibly impressed by the discipline and vast musical vocabulary it must take to perform these constant switcheroos. And once in a while, they get it right, and when they do, they're probably the most fun band on the planet Earth. I would place Flight B741 squarely in the good to great section of the King Gizzard catalog, and this is one of the better records I've heard so far in 2024. What say you, Arturo?
In King Gizzard's catalog, well, okay, personally, I think to me this album is kind of meh. I like what they're going for. I just not a fan of the execution on most of the record. Here's the thing. they're going for boogie woogie blues rock, basically. Okay.
Hmm.
And the influences you mentioned are interesting. I do hear Stephen Stills. I don't hear Leonard Skinner so much. I hear a bit of Nazareth. What I hear of is Bachman Turner Overdrive, and I
Yeah, in
hear
some respect, in
Grand
some
Funk Railroad.
yeah, Grand Funk more than Bachman Turner. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a fair comparison.
And here's the thing: this kind of music, boogie woogie blues rock, the staple of this kind of rock music, the most important part is the groove. It's like with James Brown and being on the one, for this kind of
Yeah.
music is being on the groove, maintaining the groove. And not the whole record, but there are too many songs on the record, I think, that have too many changes within the songs. There are a few too many songs that have multiple sections and movements. And because there are so many changes within the song, it doesn't allow for a groove to take place or a consistent groove to settle in. Like there are good parts of songs on this record, and you hear it, especially in the first track that you made. What was the name of the first track, Chris?
Oh, yeah.
Track one.
What is the name of the first song?
You
Mirage
mentioned it.
City. Mirage
Yes,
City.
Mirage City. Like, okay, there's a great groove midway through, but
Yep.
I'm not a fan of the way it begins and the way it ends. The groove itself should have been the song, I think. However, there are a couple of really good tracks. I do agree with you. Field of Vision is the best song on the record. And first, it's the most rocked out song on the record.
Yeah.
And it's the song where they're most convincing in their 1970s boogie woogie chugal rock.
Yep.
It's the most convincing song on the record. It's not too busy. It's not overly complicated. They're not making multiple chord progressions and okay, now we'll go into another section of the song. All that musical ADD that I think King Gizzard at their worst, they suffer from that.
Yeah,
His
they do.
musical ADD. And there's a little bit too much of that in this album, which really shouldn't have it, because this is the kind of music, this is the kind of rock music that's supposed to be kind of dumbed down in a good way.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not a total piece of crap. I mean, there are a couple of songs I really like. I said Field of Vision. We're going to put that on our Spotify playlist for sure.
Yep.
But that's one of the best rock songs of the year. But yeah, that's the reason why I'm not as high on this record as you are, Chris.
Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, folks. 1972 commences. Earlier in this episode, during this episode's parameter setter, I explained why we're ending this series in 1972, because it's, in a weird way, it's the end, but it's also kind of the beginning. The 1970s really begins here. And any conversation of the year 1972 has to start with those five grizzled British rockers, the Rolling Stones, and their epic classic Exile on Main Street. If it's even possible, the story behind this album is at least as interesting as the music. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about Exile on Main Street and the Rolling Stones and just the kind of the wildness that was happening, and it kind of defined this record. As individual years go, it doesn't get much nuttier than it was for the Rolling Stones the year before in 1971.
Yeah.
After having blown up bigger than ever the previous 3 years, the band had, in a humorous light, a quality problem on its hands. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the band and their bandmates owed a whole bunch of money to the British government in back taxes. The band responded as any outfit referred to routinely as the greatest rock band in the world should, by fleeing the UK and avoiding arrest and hiding out in France, first Paris and then to a chateau out in the country. That's where most of the 1972 release Exile on Main Street, and arguably on the short list of the great rock and roll albums ever made, was recorded. So that explains the location of the recording. But what of the mood of the record, which remains joyous, loose, and triumphant throughout? Well, that one you can pin somewhat miraculously on a combination of drugs, scheduling conflicts, and cabin fever. This may be history's most disjointedly created great record. Keith Richards' love of heroin had blown up into a full-on addiction by the time recording began in the summer of 71. The party, it seems, never quite stopped, to the point where Richards' buddy Graham Parsons got himself kicked out of that chateau for partying a little too hard. That was an issue, the constant partying. So was Bill Wyman's dislike of the chateau, the remote location of which required mobile recording on site. The pure weirdness of the situation chased Wyman away from many of the recordings, leaving guitarist Mick Taylor and session players to man the bass on at least half the songs on the record. And then there were distractions that sometimes took Mick Jagger and drummer Charlie Watts out of the picture for various sessions. Things remained so loose for so long that a series of Los Angeles-based overdub sessions featuring pianist Nicky Hopkins, various horn players, and Jagger was needed in early 1972 to actually complete the record. Geesh. So there you go. Never has a band been so distracted and so unaccountable to one another, yet sounded so in the pocket as the Stones do on Exile. Neat trick if you have the goods to pull it off. And there's no question that the Stones were at their absolute zenith as a band on these songs, which touch upon blues, country, boogie-woogie, rhythm and blues, and surprisingly, more than a dollop of gospel. Exile on Main Street begins with what I think is rock's most awesome 1-2 punch. There's the rollicking, celebratory rhythm machine that is Rocks Off, and then there's the incendiary, balls-out, brilliant 2-minute slab of greatness, Rip This Joint, which is just about the most purely rock and roll thing ever laid down on tape by white people. From there, we get exquisite balladry in the form of Tumbling Dice, Sweet Virginia, and Shine a Light. We get the pumped-up gospel fervor of All Down the Line, Loving Cup, and Let It Loose. We get the raw blues power of a cover of Slim Harpo's Shake Your Hips, and on originals like Turd on the Run and Ventilator Blues. We also approach rip-roaring Nirvana on Keith Richards' finest solo moment as a Rolling Stone, Happy, and on Casino Boogie and joyous album closer, Soul Survivor. So then I guess it took the loosest reins on sanity to harness something this tight, this focused, this confident, and this flawless. It's a work of magic, really, when a band had grown so competent and so strong and so professionally self-assured that it could withstand any obstacle thrown its way or thwart any attempt at self-sabotage, of which there were many, 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 many in 1971 and 1972, and produce a record this good. Long live Exile on Main Street, one of the best beautiful messes in all of creation, and coincidentally, it's number 14 on the most recent edition of the Rolling Stone list of the 500 greatest albums of all time.
Too low.
Arturo, I know you have a lot to say about Exile on Main Street. I know it's probably your favorite rock record, and I know that you maintain it's the best. It's the best. For me, the best is Highway 61 Revisited, but Exile on Main Street is definitely top 10. Go ahead and tell us your thoughts on Exile.
For an album that is indisputably one of the greatest and most iconic in rock history, if there's one criticism that haters wrongfully bestow upon Exile on Main Street, is its lo-fi, subterranean, grungy sound quality. This is wrong on several levels.
Yes, it is.
First, if you know the historical and circumstantial context in which the record was made, it makes perfect sense that Exile's sound reflects the hedonistic, debauched, decadent, displaced, disturbed, and overall turbulent lifestyle that surrounded the band at this time.
Yeah, because it was recorded in the basement of a party house out in the country.
Right.
On a mobile unit. So go ahead.
Yeah, with the mobile truck outside and the sound feeding into it, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, the Rolling Stones legendary truck, it was their mobile recording studio. It was basically a truck that had a soundboard / mixing board and tape machines, and they could record anywhere they wanted to, and they would through cables wire the sound into the truck and just mix it there. But anyway,
Yeah.
to not be aware of, or worse, to not acknowledge this context and how it literally affected every aspect of the music is, at best, depriving yourself of one of the album's many inherent charms, and at worst, just plain ignorant.
Yep.
Second, American roots music, which is what the Rolling Stones are obviously drawing from, at its essence, is not supposed to be polished.
Yeah, no shit.
Blues, rhythm and blues, soul, gospel, folk, country. These are genres that are supposed to have a certain, if not a large amount of dirt, dust, sweat, grime, and grit to them. This is what gives the music its authenticity. Combine that sound with supreme songwriting and the appropriate spaciousness and air in the production, and you have the perfect presentation of such music. And make no mistake, Exile most definitely has that space and air. It's just a heavy, sweaty, humid air that clearly reflects the tropical climate in the south of France, in which the album was physically conceived, but more importantly, evokes the hot, sweaty humidity of the deep American South that the Stones were so clearly trying to evoke here. It all makes perfect sense. Of all the aspects that make this record so special on a big picture level, I've always said that Exile on Main Street is like a prism. It's a dirty, grimy prism, mind you, but it's still a prism that takes in light from one side and emits it from another. What it takes in is all the musical elements and factors that, up to this point in 1972, went into this snarling beast called rock music. Blues, R&B, soul, gospel, New Orleans music, funk, folk, country, and early rock and roll. Because it's a dirty, grimy prism, the light that it emits is a subtle, multicolored thing that forces you to look at it carefully while also minding the shades underneath. The light that it emits is a suggestion of everything rock music is to become. The crude, rudimentary sound and attitude of punk, the claustrophobic jaggedness and spikiness of post-punk, the emotional longing and ragged jangle of early indie rock, the heaviness and otherworldliness of early alternative rock, the murky sludge and tortured soul of grunge. If you know how to listen and know how to feel, you can sense it. But more than anything else, this is the album where the Rolling Stones lay claim to being the band that did American roots music in all its incarnations better than any other white band, American, British, or otherwise, in history.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Absolutely.
They had been leading up to this since the mid-1960s, and more specifically since their Renaissance period started with Beggar's Banquet and the Jumpin' Jack Flash single in 1968. This is the album where they out-chucked Barry, they out-diddlied Bo, they out-littled Richard, they out-rayed Charles, they out-Otised Redding, they out-cooked Sam, they out-hookered John Lee, they out-edited James, they out-Mahalia Jackson, they out-professored Longhair, they out-Hanked Williams, and they out-Seegered Pete. Full-on balls on the table. Is Exile on Main Street the best album of 1972? Hell yeah. Is it the Rolling Stones' best album? Absolutely. One of the best rock records ever made? Screw that. It is the greatest rock and roll album ever made, full fucking period.
Hey, you missed a spot there. They out John, Dr. John.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a pretty good roll call, man. I gotta hand it to you.
Or they out doctored John.
Yeah, they out Dr. John, or they out greased, the the high voodoo priest. Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah, and I hadn't thought about New Orleans, but I just saw to see his face. Is that the name of it? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty New Orleans right there. So yeah, good call. Yeah, no, just a brilliant record. And it really is when you read about it and just how just out of whack everybody was and how not on the same page they were just physically and just where they were in their lives, that there's just all the distractions. and the fact that they had such a hard time getting all five guys in the same room. I mean,
Yeah.
it basically almost never happened from what you
Right.
read about it. And not,
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at the Wikipedia page for the Cliff Notes version, but all of the deeper stuff, they were rarely in the room together. I mean,
Yeah.
Happy as essentially as happy as Keith Richards, Jimmy Miller, and a sax player.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were the three guys that showed up, and so
Yeah.
they did the session with them, and then the rest of it, the horn section and some of the guitar stuff and all that, it was added in that overdub session. I
Right.
mean, you got to admit that's pretty brilliant stroke of post production that they
Right.
make it work. That they take the griminess of those basement mobile recordings and they're able to maintain it, without overwhelming it with studio craftsmanship afterwards.
Right.
That's another aspect, and I didn't know about that until I studied that for this episode. That so much of it was done post production,
Yeah.
and Mick Jagger kind of supervised that. It's like, because Jagger, I guess he missed a lot of those sessions. Like
In
he
France.
yeah in
Yeah.
France, like Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts. It was very come and go. Like the one constant was Keith Richards, and half the time he was too fucked up to play. It's just remarkable that they pull. It's like they were so locked in, like I said, that they just pulled that they could pull an album like Exile on Main Street out of their asses at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And just that's just phenomenal. It's like I said, neat feat for
Right.
sure.
All right. The other main story of 1972, you cannot escape it, is the big glittery elephant in the room,
Yep,
David Bowie and his
yep.
Ziggy Stardust album. After Space Oddity was a big hit for David Bowie in 1969, he struggled a bit to follow it up with more commercial success. This isn't to say that what Bowie did after before his Ziggy Stardust breakthrough wasn't any good. His 1970 album, The Man Who Sold the World, was a compelling hard rock album that evoked elements of heavy metal and progressive rock while putting forth some seriously apocalyptic abstract lyrics. See Nirvana and Kurt Cobain and their
Mhm.
epic cover of that song on their MTV Unplugged performance. Bowie's 1971 album, Hunky Dory, which we discussed in detail in the previous episode of our second Golden Age of Rock series, wasn't a huge commercial success, but it was revered by critics all over music media, and
Yeah.
along with T-Rex's Electric Warrior, helped usher in the glam rock era with its hyper melodic, bombastic piano pop and homoerotic lyrical references. Usually, when artists have their breakthrough moment, it's a matter of them being true to themselves and being as honest and as transparent as possible.
Yeah.
Not so with David Bowie.
Nope.
His stroke of genius was to create a character that would serve as a musical costume to represent his new musical direction, a souped up, Velvet Underground inspired brand of sleazy rock and roll that would be in turns epic, grandiose, emotionally charged, anthemic, cathartic, and movingly poetic. The very loose concept of the album is basically a sexually androgynous bisexual alien who arrives on Earth to save humanity with rock and roll before the apocalypse comes. He indeed wins the hearts of his fans and the general public, but eventually succumbs to his own ego and arrogance and falls from grace. Essentially, it's a rumination on the cost of stardom, the cult of personality, and what it all says about a decaying society. Such would be the impact of the album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, that within a year, T-Rex would look quaint by comparison, while all the other glam rock bands followed in its wake found themselves with a ridiculously large shadow to come out from under. The songs themselves are enduring, timeless classics of the rock canon, up there in recognition and iconic status as the best of Elvis and the Beatles. Starman, Moon Age Daydreams, Ziggy Stardust, Suffragette City, 5 Years, Rock and Roll Suicide. Overnight, Bowie became the defining figure of the glam rock movement, while ironically proving to be the glam rock artist with the most staying power by virtue of his uncanny ability to eventually pivot away from the movement and delve into multiple styles and genres. but that would come later. As far as 1972 goes, this was the year David Bowie shook the world with a style and sound that was instantly unforgettable and would resonate with multiple ensuing generations of fans and musicians. We're going to talk about other critical artists and albums on this episode, but one can argue that this particular album alone is where the 1970s really started. Chris?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think that's right. This album is incredible. I've always been a huge fan of Ziggy Stardust. I actually, and here's a core disagreement between Arturo and I. I actually have Ziggy Stardust ahead of Exile on Main Street on the greatest albums.
Whoa.
Yeah, I actually have it ahead of Exile on Main Street.
Wow.
Slightly. If I would probably put Exile on Main Street probably about like 7 or 8. I have Ziggy Stardust at like 5.
Wow.
I think this is one of the best albums ever made. I think it's just a brilliant concept, and the music on it is just extraordinary. I mean, just the sheer variety in the music. Where you get like a wham bam thank you ma'am, literally rocker and suffragette city.
Right.
Juxtaposed with kind of a slow acoustic elegy in Rock and Roll Suicide. You get the spacey, kind of the spacey twins of Moon Age Daydream and Starman. And then follow that up with like Lady Stardust and just a lot of and Ziggy Stardust and just all those riffs, all the Mick Ronson stuff. I mean, 5 Years, which is one of the best album openers ever. I mean, it's one of the most compelling first 60 seconds of a record of all time.
Wow.
I mean, the way that it just draws you in with that mood. And it starts it's like an album that starts with creeping dread, and then gets slightly more celebratory, but never kind of loses its dread. It's just it's like basically it's like the most bum trip fun time imaginable, and that's what's really captured on the record, and then his commitment to the character. And some of the really strange shit like Moon Age Daydream and Starman, again, back to back. I mean, you talk about celestial shit. That is just extraordinary. So, yeah, Bowie really, this is one of the great accomplishments in the history of rock and roll, which is, and you said it, the amazing thing about Bowie is that this would be a peak album, or this would be the career high for most artists. But he got back there 5 years later with Low.
Yeah.
And the fact that he reinvented himself, and then he had a couple of like Station to Station, which is an amazing record, and Scary Monsters, which is a very underrated record, and the fact that he could reinvent himself like that and get back to, at least with Low, could get back to something just as smashing and just as groundbreaking as this record. So yeah, I do put Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The Rise and Fall. I definitely put this album ahead, just slightly ahead of Exile. For as rockin' as Exile is, it doesn't have the depth, it doesn't have the texture, and it doesn't have the pure emotional depth. I don't think of. I mean, it's got honesty, but it doesn't have that kind of resonant musical depth, emotional depth that Ziggy Stardust does. Beautiful record.
Now, speaking of albums that are the best of their particular genre or era.
Yeah, absolutely. Good transition. So we go from the best glam rock album of all time to the best blaxploitation album of all time. Blaxploitation, we established on the last episode of this here podcast, can be defined as its own genre, which is to say that films that were explicitly written for films starring black actors, directed by black directors, and depicting anti-heroes getting one over on the man and standing up for the people of their oppressed neighborhoods. And from that came some glorious music, some glorious funk, some glorious soul, and some really just orchestrally rich music. Doesn't get any better though than this album that we're going to cover now, which is 1972's Superfly soundtrack by Curtis Mayfield. This is probably, and maybe not so probably, the best soundtrack album ever made. Calling it a soundtrack is kind of an insult because if any film could be completely, if any soundtrack album could be completely divorced from its film and still work, it's Superfly. And let us explain why here. Now, Superfly, the famed 1972 blaxploitation film, depicts its main character, a cocaine pusher who schemes for a big score to help him retire, but winds up in a tangle with corrupt cops as a heroic figure. Now, Superfly, the brilliant 1972 Curtis Mayfield album that serves as a soundtrack to the film, paints that main character and his life as anything but heroic. Director Gordon Parks Jr. got way more than he bargained for, much, much more, when he hired Mayfield to write and record this music. Mayfield's purposeful decision to go against the grain of the actual film with his music leads to ingenious results, a lush maximal tapestry of songs that bubble with alternating waves of menace and sorrow. Sometimes, as on the funky as hell Freddy's Dead, the menace and sorrow intermingle, forming a mournful lament over the tragic end result of a life of crime suffered by a supporting character in the film. The juxtaposition of the fat, party-worthy bass line and congas on one end and the lilting flute riffs on the other offer a tension that drives this tale of heartache amid the allure of the streets all the way home. The most rousing and most celebratory sounding thing on Superfly, which is the 100-second long instrumental Junkie Chase, still manages to cast a little bit of sadness via downbeat piano notes in among the wah-wah riffage and horn punches. Even the soundtrack's requisite blaxploitation love theme. Now, every single one of these blaxploitation soundtracks had at least one of these love themes.
Yeah.
Makes the loving sound kind of sort of pained due to Mayfield's emotive falsetto delivery and his horn-like guitar notes deep down in the mix. Now, the album hits its highest mark on the unbelievable Pusher Man, which builds on a lurking, damn near predatory bass line to become an evocative anti-hero anthem. In its lyrics, Mayfield plays a braggadocious drug dealer who, while advertising his trade and its collateral damage as cool and breezy on the surface, makes it clear that there's a danger to everything he clearly gets off on. It's one of the most tense and spectacularly dark songs in the entire canon of 1970s funk. I mean, check out this lyric. I'm your mama, I'm your daddy, I'm that N in the alley. I'm your doctor when in need, want some coke, have some weed. You know me, I'm your friend, your main boy, thick and thin. I'm your pusher man. Ooh, now that is a burn on Ghetto Life if there ever was one. Wow. Last episode, we spent an hour plus talking up and counting down the best of the rest of the music within the broader blaxploitation film genre. Clearly, though, Superfly, along with Isaac Hayes' Shaft soundtrack the year before in 1971, set the template for all the other artists to follow. How dramatic and evocative could you get while remaining your most disciplined as a musician? That was the challenge laid down by Hayes and Mayfield, one that was frankly never met again, and honestly, the only artists who ever came close were Hayes and Mayfield on other blaxploitation soundtracks they created in subsequent years. Superfly, as a result, is one of rock's greatest accomplishments, delicious cinematic music that delivers a gut punch of blistering social commentary that no one approaching Superfly the film could have expected walking into the theater. Genius stuff, Arturo, right?
Yeah. Here's my controversial opinion. You rank Ziggy Stardust ahead of Exile on Main Street. I rank Superfly ahead of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On.
Yeah, I do too, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I actually have it ranked very high in my list of the 500 greatest albums ever made. Two things. Number one, you already mentioned the musical parts, but lyrically, one of the things that I like about this album more than Marvin Gaye's record is that while Marvin Gaye makes his socio-political commentary and his state of the world worries and concerns, but he does it on a macro level. Mayfield does it on a micro level.
Oh, yeah.
He's
Oh yeah.
actually talking about the people who are affected by the ills of society. He goes right in there. He goes right into the abandoned tenement building where the junkies are shooting up. He goes right into the troubled home with the alcoholic father beating up his wife and kids. He goes right into the drug overdoses. He goes right into the junkie chase. He
Yep.
goes right into Freddie dying. He goes right into the dealers, the drug dealers. I mean, he goes right into kids running away from home,
Yeah.
specific people and characters,
Yeah,
and he
nothing
makes
is
you,
spared. Nothing
yeah,
is
and
spared.
he makes you feel it. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Marvin Gaye makes you feel something with what's going on, but it's more like a like a homily. Curtis Mayfield kind of gets in there and disturbs you in a
Oh, he
good
gets
way.
you in the balls.
Yeah, he gets you in the
Yeah.
balls, right? And
Yeah.
and on the other and going back and then on going forward, we live in the year 2024, and it really pisses me off when people like contemporary music media review or critics, and they all talk about the great R&B soul artists of all time. They always mention Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Prince, and Michael Jackson. Why does Curtis Mayfield not get mentioned alongside? He's every bit
He
as good
should.
as they are,
Oh
if
yeah, he
not
was
maybe
brilliant.
better than some of them.
Yeah,
Mayfield is never mentioned.
yeah, and he should be. I mean, his arrangement style, I mean, that maximalism with with the wah wah guitars and the fuzz bass and the horns and the strings and
Right.
just everything. That just it's just an intoxicating mix, and he just was brilliant in how
Yeah.
and how controlled it all was. That you could
Yeah.
have like 40 pieces. It's like amounts to a 40-piece orchestra, and it's
Right.
so controlled,
Right.
and so supple. It's just
Right.
amazing the control that he had over his arrangements.
Yeah, I mean, he could do it all. He was an amazing songwriter, amazing lyricist, great singer, underrated guitar player, amazing producer, arranger. Like, I mean, people talk about Prince being all those things, and it's true. Curtis Mayfield was already doing that. Curtis Mayfield was doing socially conscious music with the Impressions in the late 1960s,
Yep.
before anyone in Motown was doing it, before Marvin Gaye was doing it. I
Hmm.
mean, before James Brown was doing it.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, this guy needs to be put up there. He needs to be mentioned on a contemporary level. Contemporary modern music media needs to acknowledge this guy alongside with James Brown and Marvin and Stevie and Prince and Michael and or Diana or all those other great ones. He needs to be mentioned. It really pisses me off that he's been
Yeah.
lost in the cracks, and he
Yeah,
shouldn't be.
yeah, he really is a forgotten entity, even among like music journalists. He's just even the older ones, it seems like he's a forgotten entity, and he needs to there needs to be a Curtis Mayfield revival, man. You and I should like take that up as a cause.
There needs to be a hip hop artist. Maybe Kendrick Lamar needs to like get a bunch of Curtis Mayfield samples and make an album based on that. Maybe that'll do it.
Yeah. Yeah, or Kanye,
Oh, fuck Kanye. No,
I
no, no.
mean,
We don't want him. We don't want him.
assuming anyone is willing to look past his Nazism, which
No, no, fuck
probably
him.
won't
It
happen.
needs to be someone decent. It needs to be someone decent.
Hmm.
Yeah, Curtis Mayfield doesn't deserve a Nazi sampling him, okay?
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty much true. Yeah, black Nazi can't do it.
All right. Now, speaking of the opposite of Nazism,
Yeah,
Stevie Wonder. Throughout the 1960s, the teenaged Stevie Wonder was one of the Motown label's brightest stars. Along with Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, the Supremes, the Temptations, and the Four Tops, Wonder delivered a clutch of hit singles on both the R&B and pop charts that put Motown at the vanguard of Black self-sufficiency and determinism, and helped make the record label one of the most iconic names in music history. Uptight, I Was Made to Love Her, Shooby Dooby Doo Da Day, My Cherie Amour, Signed, Sealed, Delivered. These were classics that not only grooved and crackled with the punchy energy of Motown at its best, but they also exhibited Wonder's knack for producing exquisitely crafted pop songs that stood the test of time. Wonder came of age in the spotlight, but also amidst the turbulent socio-political climate that was the 1960s. And as the 1970s dawned, like several other artists in Motown chafing under label boss Berry Gordy's strict musical conservatism, Wonder felt the urge to spread his wings and expand musically, stylistically, lyrically, and just overall artistically. And it wasn't a case of Marvin Gaye putting out the mature, sophisticated landmark album What's Going On in 1971, and all of a sudden, former teeny bopper icon Stevie Wonder was making Talking Book. No. Wonder's road to this album was a slow evolutionary process that had some marking points. Wonder's first foray into grown-up pop was the bewitching album Where I'm Coming From, which came out in 1971. The album's instrumental arrangements already show Wonder stretching out with the use of clavinet and synthesizer bass. There are musical passages that are downright Bach-like and prove that Wonder was never some mere shouty pop singer. Lyrically, there are some growing pains as Wonder is trying to tackle the same socio-political issues Gaye confronted on his album of that year, but too often the lyrics come off as strained, contrived, and a bit pretentious. After all, he was only 20 years old when this record came out.
Yeah.
In 1972, Wonder made a big leap forward with Music of My Mind, the first album made under his new Motown contract that gave him complete artistic control over his music. Being inspired by the electronic music group Tonto's expanding headband, here is where Wonder really dives headfirst into synthesizers as they're peppered and sprayed all over the album, giving it a sound that, at the time, was both modern and futuristic. Wonder's songwriting chops were growing by leaps and bounds, as evident by the sophisticated jazzy pop of Superwoman and the epic scorching funk rock of Keep On Running. Music of My Mind didn't produce any major hits, but it sold well on both the Billboard R&B and pop charts, proving that Wonder had staying power as an albums artist. And then came Talking Book. Released in October of 72, right after Wonder had his red-hot stint opening for the Rolling Stones during the Stones summer tour.
God, you imagine those shows?
I know. And gaining a whole new album-oriented, rock-friendly audience that Wonder got from this tour. This is the album that changed Wonder's career and kicked into high gear his amazing run of albums that established him as one of the defining and most important figures of 1970s popular music. Starting with the gorgeous, timeless ballad, You Are the Sunshine of My Life, and moving on to the murky, clavinet-drenched blues rock crunch of Maybe Your Baby. Talking Book is a tour de force of groundbreaking sonic adventurism and masterclass songwriting. Everything Wonder had done in his career so far led him to this point. Of course, no conversation of this album is complete without mentioning the colossal single Superstition, a #1 hit in the US that not just proved to be one of the greatest dance floor filling funk songs of all time, but also a track that showed how much Wonder had grown and developed as an astute lyricist and chronicler of societal issues and the human condition. It's a near perfect masterpiece. I can't stand the maudlin, sentimental tripe of You and I, something Wonder has been guilty of throughout his career.
Yeah.
But then anyway, regardless, this album, it's a near perfect masterpiece that marks the beginning of Stevie Wonder's classic period and one that would see him release even better albums later on. Chris?
Yeah, I think you made a good point that, people talk about Gaye's progression and his breakthrough and this sort of stunning sign of freedom and this sort of they talk kind of Gaye's sudden artistic emergence. You can't really say that about Stevie. Stevie had been building this for several years. And so he gets to this point, and this is where he gets to that sophistication where he takes the synthesizers to another level. He takes the songwriting to another level, and he really kind of finds his pop voice. For what it's worth, my wife and I, our first dance at our wedding was to "You Are the Sunshine of My Life."
Oh,
yeah. Now I know it's about his first kid, but it works as a love song too.
Sure.
And so we danced on the altar. It was during COVID, so we couldn't have a reception. So we made sure we danced like right after we took our vows and announced ourselves as man and wife. We danced to "You Are the Sunshine of My Life."
You are the sunshine of my life as long as you wear a mask.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty much how it went. But yeah, no, great album. Obviously, Superstition is just a massive, just a juggernaut of a single. It doesn't get any better than the horns and
Yeah.
clavinet mix on that song. I mean, that's just instrumentally just some brilliant decision making on Stevie Wonder's part. And so, yeah, this is the beginning of the brilliant period that, leads up to Songs in the Key of Life a few years later.
I
And,
think Intervisions is his best album. The
yeah,
way it's
I kind
produced.
of do too. Songs in the Key of Life is a little too long.
Yeah.
But yeah, he just kept getting more and more brilliant from here. It's like each album, the growth and sophistication, and I mean his synthesizer programming skills just became otherworldly
Yeah.
during this period. It's just unbelievable. He was like the master of the synthesizer. Not bad for a blind guy to be able to, I guess Quincy Jones nicknamed his synthesizer setup the Thousand-Eyed Monster because it had so many wires and so many connections to it. So
Yeah.
just brilliant stuff. And yeah, great album. Can't deny it. And yeah, You Are the Sunshine of My Life. Always have a special place in my heart. One of my favorite songs of all time. And hey, I danced to it at my wedding. So there you go.
On this episode, we concluded our second Golden Age of Rock series. For the next episode, we're going to deep dive into a band whose first album came out just after this second Golden Age ended. Creedence Clearwater Revival may have invented the template for Southern rock, and the Allman Brothers Band may have given it its soulful identity. But it was Lynyrd Skynyrd that codified its aesthetic, its style, its sound, and, for better or for worse, its cultural ideology. When singer-songwriter Ronnie Van Zant led the band in the 1970s, they took deep Southern American roots music such as blues and country and gave it a riff-heavy, hard rock crunch as well as a devastating swagger that made being Southern seem cool. Then Van Zant and several other band members died in a tragic plane crash, giving Skynyrd a mythic aura. Until in the 1990s, when Van Zant's younger brother Johnny resurrected the band and they became the unfortunate torchbearers for flag-waving, gun-toting, Bible-thumping right-wing conservatism in rock. Yeesh. But fear not, we're going to focus on the good era of this band. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Lynyrd Skynyrd, A Checkered Legacy. Now, speaking of another beginning of a classic album run, one of your favorites, Chris.
Yep, we're talking about Al Green. Speaking of brilliant black music practitioners, he released two albums in 1972, Let's Stay Together and I'm Still in Love with You, that really kind of paved the road for him to establish himself as probably the greatest soul singer on earth and also one of the great arrangers along with Willie Mitchell in the history of popular music. So let's talk about Al Green a little bit here. Al Green stands as one of the most towering figures of 1970s popular music. He didn't just earn his victories with his gorgeous, soaring, incredibly powerful singing voice. He also had a command of rhythm and the beat that made his best music seductive, hypnotic, and so carnal. While Green broke into the mainstream a couple years after his Memphis peers at Stax, there's a stark difference between the music that Isaac Hayes, Steve Cropper, and friends pumped out at Stax and the music that Green and main musical collaborator Willie Mitchell cranked from the same city. Green's fare was somehow simultaneously fuller and earthier, produced and mixed to put Green's vocals and the drumming on the same level, right smack dab in the middle of the song. That makes Green's ridiculously great voice as much of a rhythm instrument as it is a lead actor. It's one of the neatest feats ever pulled off by anyone in popular music. Now, Green first earned notice in 1971 with his album Al Green Gets Next to You, which was named after his cover of the Temptations hit. Check that album out for one of my personal favorite Al Green songs, I'm a Ram. Great groove on that song. It's just like the most groove-tastic song ever. But Green really started to hit his stride and earn widespread acclaim in '72 with the twin soul romps Let's Stay Together and I'm Still in Love with You. Now, the title tracks to each album remain widely played on radio and in television commercials. They're inescapably part of the rock canon, and you probably know them well. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know them very well. But the rest of the songs on these albums comprise a fantastic collection of hard-hitting soul songs, which are consistently spiked with deceptively great rhythm guitar playing, hard-smacking drums, and horn solos that sound like they've been borrowed from heaven. Green had a gift for making prurient sexual longing sound like true romance, which he displays masterfully on a song like What Is This Feeling from Let's Stay Together. He just sounds so happy as he slithers into the melody with, I suspect, an insincere appeal to a woman's heart. He also sounds illegitimately heartbroken, even while being humbled on his rousing, slow-cooking cover of the Bee Gees' How Do You Mend a Broken Heart. It's a hammy but nevertheless brilliant vocal delivery by one of the only people who can pull this sort of thing off. Amusingly, Barry Gibb was one of the others. He turns up the romantic horn dog meter to a sharper degree on I'm Still in Love with You, one of the best R&B albums ever made. One Green actually surpassed the next year with his album Call Me. Love and Happiness is an over-the-top celebration of both, with a driving drum beat, crisp punchy horns, and sexy female backing vocals. Green and Mitchell travel the opposite direction in terms of mood and tempo with Simply Beautiful, on which the music is barely audible at times, but where Green's near falsetto never wavers in confidence. He's in it for the booty here, and hell, he might just get it with with music that's this alluring. I'm Still in Love with You peaks late on the absurdly great soul ballad Look What You Done for Me, on which a lush string section tracks Green's smooth high register. Loving You Baby is where it's at, Al sings at one point, and the blues guitar lick and glorious horns on the chorus prove he means it. As I said, Green actually surpassed the majesty of these two records on 1973's Call Me, which reaches some of the most glorious heights in the history of popular music. But these albums do set the tone and make the declaration that Green was a force of nature that could not be meddled with. While he found Christ a few years later and retired for decades from R&B, the Reverend remains a singular figure in soul music. Very, very few people can claim to reside in his stratosphere. That will probably always be the case. Arturo, what's your thought on Al Green?
I mean, aside from his vocals, I mean, you pretty much, said everything needs to be said about his voice. It's the production of Al Green's records that always stand out to me. The crispness of the instrumentation. It just sounds like it's right there in the living room with you, and the space and the ambiance, like the space between the instruments, the space between the notes. It's just as much a musical instrument as the musical instruments.
Oh yeah. I mean, his command of rhythm in that sense was amazing, and that ability to place his music right in the center of the rhythm is just a gift.
Yeah,
it's a real gift.
Crisp and spacious. Yeah, all the songs are about wanting to fuck a girl, but it doesn't matter because when the songs are when the music is this tight, and the rhythms are so tight, and the voice is so convincing, keep bringing songs about fucking. Who cares? Keep it on.
Absolutely. Yeah, Green was just brilliant, and he just inspired, and he showed just how inspired he was, coincidentally, which, a few years later, it always bears mentioning that the Al Green R&B chapter effectively ends with the song Bell in 1977, which is
great album, by the way, one of his very best albums.
Yeah, it's a great album, but essentially what Bell, the song is it's a dialectic between Al, the gospel man, and R&B itself, and he's basically saying goodbye to Al. He's basically saying goodbye to R&B. It's you that I want, but it's him that I need. And so, but he does it in like the most beautiful, most perfect R&B song ever.
Yeah.
And so he's making a gospel statement in like R&B clothing, and it's just brilliant. But so that's the way it ends. And so that's the end of the road. But until then, that guy was R&B crooner number one. He was incredible.
Yeah, really was. All right, so we did three consecutive brilliant artists in the realm of R&B, soul, funk. Let's get back to the rock, which is what the Curmudgeon Rock Report really is all about. And here's the thing. One of the things that marks 1972 as such a pivotal year and why we call it the end of the second golden age of rock, an age defined by the 1960s, is that so many important debut albums came out this year that helped define the 1970s. Hell, even if the David Bowie, Stevie Wonder, and Al Green albums we talked about weren't their respective first records, they might as well have been, because their albums of this year mark when their respective importance truly began. As for the actual debut albums, let's run them down. First, the Eagles with their self-titled album, Eagles. Graham Parsons may be the figure who will always be remembered as the guy who kickstarted the country rock movement with the Byrds in the late 1960s, but it was the Eagles who drove the point home and became country rock's biggest ever crossover superstars with the smashing success of their self-titled debut album. Co-written with Jackson Browne, Take It Easy became an anthem for stoned out slackers and escape-loving aging hippies everywhere. Witchy Woman, a swampy rocker that predated their heavier sound to come, is an ambivalent ode to author F. Scott Fitzgerald's bohemian party monster wife. Both of these songs hit the top 20 of the pop chart. And then there's one of the band's best covers ever, their version of Jack Tempchin's Peaceful Easy Feeling. Lush, mellow country rock at its finest that defies you not to fall under its spell. This album kickstarted the Eagles' ascent into eventual stadium-filling status, and at least in the US, arguably as the band of the decade. Chris?
Yeah, this album is an interesting story in the sense if you track the evolution of the Eagles, how I mean you've got Glenn Frey, who was basically the Forrest Gump of rock and roll, who fell in with Bob Seger when he was still living in Detroit and plays rhythm guitar on Ramblin' Gamblin' Man.
Yeah.
And then moves to LA and answers an ad to join Kenny Rogers' band. uh, and basically sessions for Kenny Rogers. And then, along with Henley and Bernie Leadon and Randy Meisner, is hired to back up Linda Ronstadt.
Yep.
And along the way, Frey and Henley are picking up tips on songwriting, and they're making friends with Jackson Browne and J.D. Southern. And they unapologetically basically used all these people to put themselves in a position to succeed, and they pulled it off.
Right.
That's the thing. It's like, they used their connections, and they had the ambition of, okay, now, we've gotten what we need out of you. Now we're going to be more successful than you. But they had the goods too. They came out with all those melodies and
Right.
and all those harmonies. It's the harmonies on this record that really define it. I mean, they were one of the better harmony groups of the 1970s, and just beautiful stuff. Like the harmony on Take It Easy is incredible. I love the banjo too on Take It Easy. Like Bernie Leadon. That guy was one kick-ass banjo player, man. And so just a lot of great country touches. Like Witchy Woman is a great song. And like most of the Eagles records, I mean, you can't call it a classic record. I think it deserves 3.5, maybe 4 stars. Like the first few Eagles records have a bunch of great Henley and Frey and other co-writers songs. And then it's backfilled by poor Bernie Leadon, or Bernie Leadon. Like he was kind of the country rock heart of the group. He was the one that had the multi-instrumentation and the country soul, but he never wrote a hit for the band. He's the only one that never really wrote a hit for the band. And but he would backfill the record with his country rock nuggets, which were nowhere near hits. They barely had hooks. And so so that's the one thing you could say about early Eagles records, is that they're propped up. The only reason they could become albums was because of Bernie Leadon's songbook.
Right.
But what defined them was the stuff that Henley and Frey were pumping out with their friends.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
And I think the next year's album, Desperado, is terrific.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's their second best record.
Yeah. All right. The next great debut album of 1972, Steely Dan with Can't Buy a Thrill. Known as a Los Angeles band, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen were actually hardened, cynical New York City boys who moved out west to form their band and seek their fame and fortune. They definitely achieved that with their very first album that, like with the Eagles, made them instant stars and one of the major names in rock for the rest of the decade. Do It Again took the Latin rock and salsa vibes of Santana all the way to number 6 on the pop chart. Reelin' in the Years, a blazing slice of up-tempo jazz rock with a guitar solo that Jimmy Page once called his favorite ever, was another huge hit, landing at number 11 on the pop chart. Dirty Work, one of the few Steely Dan classics not sung by Fagen, is a gorgeous, melancholic ballad about a love affair caught in a doomed cycle of manipulation. Both curmudgeons will always disagree about the merit of a later period Steely Dan, but we can both agree that their early records perfectly showcased a tight, jazzy R&B blues rock combo with prodigious songwriting talent.
Oh
Chris?
yeah. I mean, I love their first two records. Can't Buy a Thrill has just got like one great nugget on it after another. Like Midnight Cruiser is a great song. Brooklyn Owes the Charmer Under Me is a perfect song. I mean, and that's another one that Donald Fagen doesn't sing. And so
Right.
it's just kind of weird to hear Steely Dan with this weird falsetto thing going on.
Yeah.
Uh, but and then album closer, Turn That Heartbeat Over Again is perfect too. So it's just a really rollicking, really rousing, really melodic, tuneful album like you said, you have the crankers like Reeling in the Years, but then you have a ballad like Dirty Work, which made an appearance in an episode of The Sopranos, with Tony
Yeah.
Soprano driving around singing Dirty Work, which is kind of funny when you
Yeah.
think about it. But yeah, no, I've always been a huge fan of this record, and it really kind of was a harbinger of things to come for them. That they started off, like more sophisticated than your average rock band. They were Berkeley music guys,
Yeah.
and they started off sophisticated, but they were a real band at this point too.
Mm.
And when they were a real band in those first three albums, I think there was more soul to the proceedings.
Yeah. That's
Now,
why I like their earlier stuff more.
but I do fall into the camp that thinks that Asia is their best record, and I put Asia as one of the top 50 records ever made. That album,
I have Pretzel Logic as their best album.
yeah, I just think Asia is remarkable. But this was a hell of a start for sure.
All right, next, Roxy Music and their self-titled debut album. David Bowie wasn't the only glam rock artist pushing the envelope into the realm of ambitious and visionary art rock. It's hard for music listeners now to grasp how utterly alien Roxy Music sounded when they emerged in 1972. There are few, if any, reference points one can make. Hell, if this album came out now, there are some music listeners and even some clueless critics who would claim it sounds like nothing else. Space age camp mixed with pre 1950s symphonic pop, decadent pornography music, innovative sonic textures, and occasional experimental noise intrusions. That's the best I can come up with. The giddy, soaring hit single Virginia Plain is what introduced Roxy Music to unsuspecting music listeners, but that incendiary song does little to prepare listeners for the level of sonic innovation contained within the album. Lots of bands and artists have tried to duplicate the weird sexiness of the band's sound, but few, if any, have succeeded. Roxy Music continued to make good music after Brian Eno left in late 1973, but they were never as daring, bold, and downright bizarre as when he was in the group. Chris?
Yeah, I think the combination of Brian Eno doing his synth thing and bassist Graham Simpson, who is one of the best bassists of all time. The bass playing on this record, from Virginia Plain to some of the other songs, is just incredible.
Yeah.
And just it drives the proceedings. And like you said, there's a sexiness to the record, but there's also a funkiness, kind of an odd funkiness
Yeah.
to the record, and a lot of that comes from Simpson. And so And then, Brian Ferry was a hell of a singer. I mean,
Yeah.
he was a remarkable rock singer as well. And so yeah, and yeah, the range that they came up with, you're right. They are one of the more indescribable uh bands of all time. What does Roxy music sound like? Oh, they sound like Roxy music, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much what you can say. But I think the star of the group is definitely Graham Simpson, and the bass playing here is the reason to check it out.
Yeah. All right. Next debut album that's important of this year. Neu, the German band, NEU with an exclamation point, their self-titled debut. We discussed the experimental German duo Neu at length in a previous episode of ours called, quote, a krautrock exploration. Yes, that's a hint for you, the listener, to go back into the Curmudgeonly archive and seek it out. Nevertheless, we'll give this utterly visionary band another shout out and much deserved acclaim. They didn't last long, releasing only 3 albums before they disbanded in 1975. But they did, and they didn't sell many records, despite having a passionate, loyal, albeit small fan base. However, over time, that fan base mushroomed into prominent music critics and musicians who acknowledged their immense influence. Neu fine-tuned the propulsive, metronomic, repetitive, motorique rhythm that the band Can pioneered to celestial perfection, proving a massive influence on the flowering electronic music scene throughout Europe that would eventually seep into the international music consciousness. They were also a seminal influence on what would become the UK punk scene, with Klaus Dinger's songs possessing sneering, unintelligible vocals and raw, minimally chorded guitar crunch. Throw in Michael Rother's thoroughly original, otherworldly guitar work, and you have the work of a band so original and visionary that they really were years ahead of their time. Their self-titled debut is Where to Begin. Chris?
Yeah, years ahead of their time. And Klaus Dinger is the innovator of the motorique
Yeah.
can really just kind of started to come up with those rhythms and
Yeah.
started to experiment with those rhythms. But it became a thing. It became a patented thing with Klaus
Right.
Dinger.
Yeah.
In terms of the tempo of it, in terms of how it worked, in terms of the metronomic nature of it, and then how it influenced the rest of the German scene from this moment on. Klaus Dinger is where it's at for that, and so yeah, this is a special record. It's one of the better of the krautrock records. I think, although we're going to talk about one that's better than it here in a little bit. But yeah, got to give it up for Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger. Michael Rother went on to form Harmonia. He
Yeah.
also was an original member of Kraftwerk. And so Rother and Dinger are about as influential as it gets as far as a scene.
Yeah.
Outside of the Amon Duel guys,
Yeah.
those are probably the two single most influential
Mm,
German musicians of the 70s.
yeah. Although Can would have something to say about that, but anyway.
Yeah, they might.
Yeah. All right. And the other seminal debut album of this year, Big Star, with their first record, #1 record. Like Neu, Big Star didn't sell many records. In fact, they sold substantially less and were virtually ignored in their time. But led by the songwriting duo of Alex Chilton and Chris Bell, their 1972 debut album is a shimmering, awe-inspiring collection of pop rock perfection that inspired and directly influenced a multitude of bands and artists throughout the 1980s and 90s. Seriously, while Big Star didn't have much of a commercial or musical effect on the 1970s, all the music fans of that decade who did get a hold of their 3 album catalog would go on to form bands that would make up the indie alternative rock movement of the 1980s that surged in the 1990s. REM, Matthew Sweet, Wilco, The Replacements, Teenage Fan Club, Primal Scream, Husker Du, Green Day, all owe a huge debt to Big Star. In a parallel universe version of the year 1972, Big Star's #1 record would have been as big as Elton John. Chris?
Yeah, it's hard to find songs better than the Ballad of El Goodo and
Yeah.
13.
Yeah.
Those are two of the best songs I've ever heard.
Yeah.
especially the Ballad of El Goodo. I mean, that's just like melodies from heaven. I mean,
Right.
that it's just perfect, and it's a shame that, I mean, thank goodness for Alex Chilton. Remember, he what was it, the Box Tops,
Yeah.
so he actually had some success with them, but Big Star really went nowhere. And then, over the time, by the late 90s, like, On the Street is, the theme song to That 70s Show, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden there's a revival. And so
Right.
they actually did get their moment in the song among Gen Xers like us,
Yeah.
young Gen Xers that were digging in the crates back in 1998, 1999. And so I'm glad that they were able to do that. And that was really the power of the early internet in music. The early internet didn't destroy the music industry. The early internet, what it did is it led to all this revivalism
Mm.
of, like the Congos. Heart of the Congos is another album
Yeah.
that got rescued because of these internet revivalists, and like Number One Record and Sister Lovers and all that. Those albums, they just bust out, and it was just a really special thing for Big Star to come out there. And again, the Ballad of El Goodo doesn't get any better than that. Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
All right, folks, we're almost finished with celebrating this wonderful year of 1972. Now we're going to end it with a lightning round of more all-time great albums from this year. First, another German band, I still think the greatest German band of all, Can, and their album of this year, Ege Bam Yassi. Now, arguably the greatest band to ever come out of Germany, and yes, I'm aware of the greatness of Kraftwerk. The prog rock band Can had up to this point staked their reputation on their seemingly endless jams and pioneering sound that incorporated Jackie Liebezeit's jazz-influenced yet propulsive drumming, Holger Schukai's idiosyncratic bass lines, Michael Caroli's fluid, liquid-like guitar lines, and Ermin Schmidt's avant-garde classical-based keyboard work. For this album, Can brought the funk, albeit a distinctly German brand of funk, or if funk was processed through a filter devised by a crew of classically trained musicians with a deep interest in deconstruction. A
Yep.
spacey airiness also seeps into Can's sound on this album, and the band would expand on this with their following album. On Ege Bam Yassi, however, this masterpiece of experimental rock brings us the song that was a huge hit in Germany due to its inclusion in the then popular TV show Das Messer. This was the first time the band used a drum machine in conjunction with live drums. The name of this song, by the way, that was the big hit, was Spoon. Okay, and other songs on Ege Bam Yassi that this experiment, that this masterpiece gives us. You got the twisted funk of Vitamin C, the blaxploitation movie soundtrack on acid of Pinch. Okay, and of course the aforementioned Spoon. This was the first. And by the way, the indie rock band Spoon named themselves after this song. That's a little tidbit for you out there.
Okay.
This was the first time the band used a drum machine in conjunction with live drums, and it's as haunting and eerie as it is mind-bendingly groovy. This is quite possibly Can's best album and easily one of the 500 greatest albums ever made. Chris?
Yeah, I think it's my favorite Can record because of that. There's just some cool ass drumming on this record.
Yeah.
It's just a drummer's delight, and it's a
Yeah.
tour de force of herky jerky rhythms. And here's a note to myself: it's psychedelic but industrially so. And so you can kind of hear the birth of industrial rock
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
some respects because there is some clang and bang, but
Yeah.
it's smooth clang and bang. And
Right.
there's
Right.
almost like a jazzy and psychedelic industrialness to it. It's a very eclectic album, and I like how you describe the pinch as blaxploitation-ish,
Yeah.
which is kind of true, especially since now that we're we're big fans of Theme Savage. A song so cool it has multiple drum solos. Uh, so now, can be seen in that light. And so, yeah, I'm a big fan of Ege Bamyase. I think it's their best record. And I've been vibing on it ever since we recorded the Krautrock episode a year and a half
Yeah.
ago.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Chris, tell us about your hero.
Oh, yes. My hero, Neil Young, and his breakout album, Harvest, which came out in 1972. Now, Neil Young came into 1972 primed for solo stardom, and with Harvest, he achieved it. Soft rock had become a thing in 1970, something we covered on the 1970 episode of this second Golden Age of Rock series. So too had Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and their magnificent album Deja Vu, on which Young contributed gnarly guitar solos such as the one on David Crosby's Almost Cut My Hair, and also one of Young's most beautiful songs, the plaintively melodic Helpless. He also released his solo masterpiece after the gold rush late in 1970, supplying him with some momentum that carried him through 1971. So how did he follow up? In the most blissfully commercial way possible,
Yeah.
with an acoustic bent and a country flavor defined as much by a back injury that nearly immobilized him for months by any real rural leanings anyway. The songs on Harvest are mostly gentle, soulful, and thrillingly varied. The fare ranges from the country waltz of the title song to the anthemic, politically conscious hard rock anthem Alabama, a song that has grown on me over the years and has really grown on me in the past year since I explored Neil's archives for an episode of this podcast. The album opens with the emotive yet catchy country rocker Out on the Weekend, which really, gives a good showcase to his backing band, the Stray Gators. And it closes with another rocker called Words Between the Lines of Age, which features Crosby and Graham Nash on backing vocals. And of course, there's Old Man and Heart of Gold. Any album with those two albums on it automatically cannot suck. Do I think this is Neil's best record? Nope. But is it his most quintessential? Is it where I'd tell kids looking to explore Neil Young to start? Probably. So there. Arturo?
Yeah, you know what? There's a World on this album.
Yeah,
It's
you
one of the
like that
two.
song.
Here's the thing. It's one of the two orchestral songs on the record, where the
Yeah.
big orchestral arrangements. It was my least favorite song on the album for a long time, until last year, when of all fucking people, Sufjan Stevens
Yep.
put a gorgeous, really just simple, low-key version of There's a World on his album Javelin from last year. I'm not a big Sufjan fan, but his version of that song is gorgeous, it's beautiful, and it's eloquent. And it made me go back and listen to the Neil Young original, and then I started to appreciate the huge string arrangement in it. And yeah, that's, thanks Sufjan for that. Now I think Harvest is a perfect record.
Yeah. Does that make you want to see Sufjan's Illinois Broadway musical?
Fuck no.
I mean, come on. I had to ask. Okay. So next, you're talking about Lou Reed's Transformer.
Yeah, most definitely not soft rock.
Nope.
Yeah. Lou Reed Transformer. This is not Lou Reed's solo debut, but it may as well be. And it's the album that set the tone for not only the rest of Reed's 1970s output, but for the rest of his career as well. It's fitting that Reed embraced glam rock in all its tawdry, sleazy, homoerotic, and androgynous glory, considering how the visionary work he did with the Velvet Underground inspired and influenced so much of it. Of course, you have immortal hit single and Reed's signature song, Walk on the Wild Side, a song we went into in detail in a previous episode titled The Top 40 Rock Songs About New York City, hint, Walk on the Wild Side's in the top 10. Other sterling tracks from this perfect record include Vicious, with its surreal Andy Warhol-inspired lyrics and crunching guitar riff, the VU, Velvet Underground, leftover Andy's Chest, which directly references Warhol and serves as Reed's first foray into funk, and the lush orchestral ballad Perfect Day, that, with its ambiguous lyrics, may be Reed's finest ballad as a solo artist. He put out some cracking good albums later in his career and his life, but none of them equaled this career highlight. Chris?
Yeah, agreed. And strange but true, I once got laid to Perfect Day.
Nice.
Or at least in part to Perfect Day. What a sex song that is. Yeah, that happened like years ago before I was married. Sorry, honey. But yeah, that was something. And that's just a very sexy, very rousing. Yeah, rousing is kind of that's my official word of this episode. But it's very evocative song, and like you said, it's ambiguous because you don't know if he's talking about a woman or a dude.
Yeah.
I mean that's part of it. I mean, I think Reed was kind of figuring out his sexuality on this record, and obviously he does that very explicitly on Walk on the Wild Side, his paean to drag queens. Yeah, no, there's some really strong stuff on this record, and it bears mentioning that it was produced by David Bowie and Mick Ronson. And Mick Ronson was just a genius. He just had a penchant for not just the guitar, but he also did the string arrangement on Perfect Day. He also did the mixing of the record too. And so Ronson and Bowie as a production team and as a creative force was something pretty special here in 1972. So this is the second best record they did, and it's still a 5-star.
Yeah. It was an incredible year, an incredible era. All right. Yep. Speaking of great bands continuing a winning streak, Chris, tell us about Black Sabbath.
Yeah, Black Sabbath's Volume 4, which of course is their fourth record. Black Sabbath was on a roll heading into 1972. They'd essentially invented heavy metal as we know it in 1970 with their self-titled debut and the classic album Paranoid. And they definitely invented stoner rock in 1971 with Master of Reality, which is one of my favorite albums.
Too.
And it took it only took 2 years for these guys to become bona fide rock gods. Yeah. But in the course of admiring all their moxie and their splendid riffs, the world had maybe slept on this band's musicianship, which was considerable because these dudes could play. I mean, you can't just do all that inventing without having some serious chops. So on 1972's great Volume 4, they more freely showcased their powers as musician. Drummer Bill Ward pretty much owns this album. Check out the machine gun fills on Wheels of Confusion and the jazz swing of the awesomely heavy Cornucopia. Great song and like ridiculously great drumming. It's like octopus arms drumming. Yeah. And then also check out the brilliant percussion-driven break on Supernaut, which comes out of nowhere mid-song to introduce a genuine funkiness into the proceedings. That breakdown intersperses itself into some of guitarist Tony Iommi's heaviest, grooviest riff work ever. More signs of musicianship. There's the oddly pretty slow burn ballad Changes, on which Ozzy Osbourne legitimately croons about the pains of growing up and coming in and out of love. All in all, it's another marvelous volley from a band that was pretty much perfect all the way through 1975. Arturo?
Yeah. Two things. First, the riff to Supernaut. Not only was it reportedly Frank Zappa's favorite riff, it was also Beck's favorite, not Jeff Beck, Beck Hansen's favorite guitar riff of all time.
It's one of the best of all time. It's just fucking awesome.
And now this album is the one that has the original version of the Ozzy Osbourne ballad Changes. Everyone knows it. I'm going through changes. Well, you know what? That's not even the best version of this song.
No, Charles Bradley.
2016, right before he died of cancer, the R&B soul singer Charles Bradley released his final album. And on that album is his amazing, just powerful version of Changes. Basically, it's done like a Memphis Stax Records sound. He's doing it like Otis Redding, basically. He does it like an Otis Redding ballad, and it's just moving.
And really it works.
Yeah, you should check it out. Anyone should check it out. If you don't get it, and the video is sad too. You watch the video. If it doesn't bring a tear to your eye, there's something wrong with you. All right.
Yeah.
Speaking of heavy metal from 1972, we move on to Deep Purple with Machine Head. The album that broke Deep Purple big in America and the rest of the world. This is a heavy metal classic just for the presence of its three timeless mountain shaking metal anthems. Everyone and their mother knows the riff to the enduring classic Smoke on the Water. And on a list of greatest car songs in rock history, the relentless Highway Star may be number one. Most importantly, though, Machine Head is home to this Curmudgeon's pick for the greatest Deep Purple song of all, the ridiculously goofy yet monstrously heavy Space Truckin', with its Godzilla bassline, Brontosaurus guitar riff, and Ian Gillan's voice sounding like his balls are caught in a vice. Never has there ever been a better song about riding a space truck across the solar system. Chris?
Come on, let's go space trucking. Yeah, 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 yeah. It's just phenomenal. Yeah, Deep Purple was a great band. I mean, their best album is Deep Purple and Rock, but this is a very close second. They're just rocking and they're just on through the whole thing. And they were just a really original band that just came up with some. Yeah, it was almost prog metal, but in a way, it's a combination of prog metal and proto metal. And, they're obviously the forerunner and, Judas Priest worshipped at their altar, for sure.
Yeah, easily.
Yeah, you could tell. It's just, it's funny, but just great band. Great band.
All right. Now we tone it down a bit. We go to Elton John with Honky Chateau. Elton John was already a star before this album came out with a string of hits, including Your Song, Leave On, and Tiny Dancer. However, this is the album where Elton John became a superstar because this is the one that has Rocket Man on it. Yes, you all know that song. But that's not all to this classic record. Honky Cat, the other massive hit from this album, kicks the record off with a funky slice of New Orleans-style R&B. The ballad Mona Lisa and Mad Hatters may be my all-time favorite Elton song, with Bernie Taupin's emotionally direct lyrics about New York City's socioeconomic disparity between the haves and the have-nots, or more accurately, the white upper class and the people of color. As wonderful as this album is, Elton John would outdo himself just the following year. Chris?
Yes, he would. But this album is pretty special. And like you said, the ballads, Elton John was a first-class balladeer. Yeah. And Rocket Man is probably my second favorite Elton John song.
Right.
You'll laugh. My favorite Elton John song is Crocodile Rock. Doesn't get any better than that. But Mona Lisa and Mad Hatters is pretty special too because of the lyric, but also just a really affecting melody as well. And then you have a song like Slave, which, kind of almost dabbles in kind of a country-ish vibe.
Sure.
Obviously Honky Cat does too. And so, special record. Elton John at this period could do no wrong. He was the king. He was the king of mid-tempo rock melody for about a 4-year period, really. Yeah. For between 71 and 74. He was at the height of his powers, and he was pretty special. And this is one of his better records.
Speaking of special, the next one is probably the best album by this guy that he ever made.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably his least strange. It's even though it's still a strange record, but it's his least strange. So we're talking about Todd Rundgren and the album Something Anything with a question mark, Something Anything. Right. So Rundgren had been kicking around LA for several years heading into 1972, first as the leader of the psychedelic rock band Nas, and then as a respected producer and solo artist, but he seemed to be an unlikely candidate to be a breakout star. That was until he brought his work home with him, literally, and recorded 3/4 of the brilliant double album Something Anything in his living room. He took those recordings and blended them with a freewheeling session later in the year in New York, which produced the album's biggest hit, Hello, It's Me. Hello, It's Me came out of that New York session.
Yeah.
Now combine the efforts and you get what I think is one of rock's most consistent and important double albums. I
Mm,
mean, come on, the balladry is on point. The
yeah,
silly, admittedly misogynistic rockers are on point. The
right.
power pop is so on point, it's damn near archetypal. Seriously, you can practically hear both Cheap Trick and Weezer being born on Couldn't I Just Tell You?
Yeah,
It's all on point, and so on point it made a dork like Todd Rundgren a star. Wowie.
yeah.
Turo?
Yeah, no, this is by far his best album, and what I like about this record is that his songwriting was never sharper than it was here. He
Oh, no,
would delve
no
off
doubt.
into electronic experiments. He would go on and do like prog rock with his band Utopia. Okay, but despite here's the thing: the irony of Todd Rundgren for an artist who aspired to such diversity and versatility in his musicianship and in his art, his best work was when he was confined to pop songs.
Yep.
That's when he was at his best, when he was doing pop songs. And the only other album later in his career that comes close to this, as far as songwriting wise, is Hermit of Mink Hollow from 1978. But
Yeah.
even then, it's nowhere near as good as this.
Yeah,
And after this, he splintered in so many different directions.
you got to figure, the guy stumbles upon a perfect pop formula and then immediately decides he's bored with it.
Yeah, he
I
didn't want to
mean,
be confined to it, which I
yeah,
understand.
yeah,
But
he
but
was a
it's what
restless
he's
soul.
best at. It's what he was best at. You
Yeah,
know,
and he went on to his true destiny, which was producing Bad Out of Hell
and the New York Dolls' first album.
and the New York Dolls. But come on, Bad Out of Hell. It doesn't get any better than that, man.
Not a fan of Meatloaf. You're not going to get a lot of curmudgeonly love from me.
Come on,
That
man.
record.
Jim Steinman represent, man.
Gay Springsteen is what I call it. Anyway, next, and our final album on this lightning round, The Grateful Dead Europe 72. And we end this lightning round of great 1972 albums with a triple live album. As most people know, the Grateful Dead were renowned for their live shows, much more so than their studio albums, as the endless number of high quality and professionally recorded bootlegs of their concerts throughout the years attest to. Of their official major label sanctioned live albums, none are better than this document of their 1972 spring tour of Europe. This immaculately recorded collection captures the Dead at the absolute peak of their live performance powers. As instrumentalists, they would rarely play better than this, and as vocalists, they would never sound better than this. Every version of every song is among the best versions ever recorded on a live stage, and their improvisational excursions were never more inspired or inventive. Here, the Dead reached the perfect balance of their earlier psychedelia and the jazz fusion style that their jams would embark on later on. Quite simply, one of the greatest live albums ever. Chris?
Yep. Brilliant versions of both China Cat Sunflower and Morning Dew, especially Morning Dew.
Yeah.
Because it's just they just had a beautiful take on such a schmaltzy song, and
Yeah.
then they were able to get a jam to
Right.
spring out of that. And so it just really, and that's what ends the record. So it's just really, really great. And Tennessee Jed is on it, and that's probably the most iconic recording of Tennessee Jed because
Right.
that never made a record. So
Right.
it's an important part of the Dead canon. And you're right. It's a testament to their shows, and just by being a testament and like the perfect distillation of a Dead show, that automatically puts it in the top 10 of the best live albums ever. I mean,
Yeah.
even if it kind of sucked, it would still be in the top 10 because it's such a document of history.
Right. Yeah.
You
It
know what I
really
mean?
is. Yeah.
Yep.
Really, in some ways, it's underrated, I think. But
Yeah.
all right, folks, we are finished with 1972, and we are finished with the second golden age of rock. We hope you
Sure.
liked it.
Yeah, and Arturo, send us send wax poetic a little bit about the second golden age of rock and about its importance and about why we still revere it here now, 52 years after it ended.
Well, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. It really marks the beginning of the 1970s and all the disparate strands of music and the different genres that started emerging in 1970s. It's not just rock, and it's not just R&B, soul, and funk. Disco is just around the corner. Electronic music is starting to really blow up, and well, maybe not mainstream blow up, but blow up artistically and developmentally. Reggae is just about to break out big with Bob Marley, his two albums of the following year. So it really is. This is a demarcation point year, 1972, and the second golden age is basically the 1960s. Is really what it is, and that's why I say 72. It ends the second golden age, and it marks the beginning of the 70s in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that, it's just an incredible period to think that we started it with all the Dylan and Beatles
Yeah.
and Sam Cooke. And
Yeah.
then, we end it with
Space Truckin'!
yeah, we end it with Space Truck and and Exile on Main Street and Superfly. And
Yeah.
so, where music had gone and just sort of the experimentation and the freedom that Dylan and the Beatles opened up to the world, and
Right.
and also Motown in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. The freedom that they birthed in all the artists, you see that evolution and you see that growth, and it's exponential from where we started in 64 to where we are at on January 1st, 1973. I mean,
Yeah.
it's extraordinary. So
Yeah.
glad to have manned. I think that this series of 9 episodes is going to be about 19 hours total. So 19 hours total tape dedicated to the second golden age of rock. I hope, folks, that you could check out all the episodes. And the hell, I might throw all 9 links into our show notes. Who knows? That is remains to be seen, but that remains a possibility. And with that, folks, as I always do at the end of these episodes, I encourage you, I urge you, I implore you to join our curmudgeonly community on Facebook. Lots of mirth, lots of merriment, and lots of strange nuggets that will show up on there from time to time. So we hope that you become a part of that. It's invite only, but chances are we'll let you in. You can join the community by going to facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock and join in the fun. Got any thoughts about anything we've said here? Do you disagree with me that Bowie was better than the Rolling Stones? Say so. Send us a note at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And finally, as we've been doing for the last 6 months or so, we will have a Spotify playlist attached to this episode. You'll be able to find the link to that episode, to that playlist, in the episode show notes, or in the episode description, wherever you're accessing this cast, whether it's on Apple or Stitcher or Amazon or Samsung or wherever you access your podcast. You'll be able to click onto that link and enjoy all the music, and use it as a soundtrack to the podcast. I would say listen to the episode first and then go back and listen to the music. But hell, if you want to listen to it song by song and album by album, we're perfectly fine with that too. Behold the power of the internet and of streaming.